My name is Max Banfield. Welcome to my talk. Today I'll be discussing Leonardo da Vinci, my favourite inventor. He was born in 1452 and died in 1519. In order to discuss why he was my favourite, I'd like to discuss also three other people: Charles Darwin, Semmelweis and Galileo, to show you the contrast. For instance, Darwin, Semmelweis and Galileo came up with ideas that challenged the authority of the establishment at the time. They were ridiculed, mocked, or even imprisoned. Whereas Leonardo da Vinci came up with ideas that basically glorified the establishment or their buildings, and so he was wanted. So he led quite a charmed life in contrast. So that's why I want to discuss these things. Charles Darwin spent most of his life developing his theory of evolution, a theory of natural selection or survival of the fittest. He spent much of that time not publishing because he was afraid of being criticised. And the problems were that the church authorities, for example, had been presenting the idea that we're evolved in a different way, and they didn't want people to think of anything other than that. There were also another group of people who didn't want him to succeed, and they were the intellectual establishment, the scientists of that time, who had argued that they were superior humans by way of their intellect. And as a result, they said women had smaller brains, and therefore they were only suited to housework, and that getting educated for them would strain their brains and cause some problems. And they argued that Negroes had smaller brains and that the only thing they were good for was manual labour. And it's all very convenient, but they felt threatened by Charles Darwin's idea, which was roughly interpreted as, we're all much the same, we all came from monkeys. So they ridiculed him. And Charles Darwin solved that problem to some extent by avoiding public meetings and therefore avoiding the ridicule. And he lived in a country house, and he corresponded by letter, and he had visitors come to his home. Other people championed his cause actually in meetings. Now, the second one is Semmelweis, who was a hospital doctor, and he observed that patients in his morning wards had a particular illness, and when he went to treat patients in the afternoon wards, they soon started getting the same illnesses. So he looked at his hands and he thought he must be carrying something, but he can't see it. And so he decided to do something about it, and namely he washed his hands and his surgical instruments. And he noticed that the death rate in the second ward dropped considerably. So he essentially developed the germ theory before microscopes were invented. And he told his bosses to wash their hands. Now, the problem is this. You can understand that a person who's studied medicine and got to the top of his field and become a boss of a hospital, some of them are sort of humble, some of them are arrogant, and some of them feel they have the right to make the great discoveries, not some new, young, puffy doctor. And so they'd resent that, and they did. And they ridiculed him. And the other thing was that because of this, the general sense of arrogance, They thought that washing hands was manual labour, so they refused to do it. And basically, wherever Semmelweis tried to give talks or get promoted, he was blocked. And he ended up going mad, and he either committed suicide or was murdered in a mental hospital. The germ theory wasn't confirmed until much later with the development of microscopes, when people could actually see them. Now, Galileo used telescopes to investigate the universe and promoted the idea that the sun was the centre of the universe and not the earth. And because that challenged church opinion, the church authorities felt that their credibility was threatened. So they burnt all his books, put him under house arrest, and told him not to discuss his ideas with anyone ever again. So that's what happened to him. They were all rejected, ridiculed and mocked by the established authorities. Here's Charles Darwin being depicted as part monkey. This is Semmelweis. And this is Galileo. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, by contrast, was a painter, sculptor, architect and inventor whose talents were wanted by the establishment. And his problems were, by comparison, relatively minor. People, for example, were jealous of his talents for one reason or other. For instance, he'd get a lot of the contracts to do portraits and things that others wanted. And here is one of the paintings that he's famous for, and it's the Mona Lisa. Now, you can see that people generally who lack artistic skills, which is most of us, just draw a diagram with a pencil, and Da Vinci's art, as you can see from that picture, is quite detailed. You can see the foreground and the background, which gives the impression of depth, for example. Where in actual fact, as you know, skin is very rarely black or white. Gradients in between, and Da Vinci had the capacity to identify those colours and pick dyes and paints to reflect that colour accurately. Another aspect of humans which makes them difficult to draw is how do you get the arm length and the leg length and the head dimensions in proportion. And he looked at, drew a diagram based on the work of an ancient Roman architect named Vitruvius, where he drew a circle with the man standing roughly in the centre and his arms reaching the circumference, and similarly with his feet. And that assisted him and others in drawing correct arm and leg lengths in proportion. Another thing that Da Vinci did was to cut open the human body. And what he wanted to know was, why is there shading under a person's eyebrows? Why is there shadows under the cheeks? And so when he cut open the skin away from the skull, he could see the eye sockets and, say, the shape of the jawbone and the shape of the cheekbone. So when he was drawing people later, he knew what was behind the skin, and that assisted him in producing the shading and getting the portraits accurately reflecting what the person looked like in various forms of light. He also noticed that people's arms and legs were not just straight lines, as you might see somebody young drawing a human with straight lines, 2 arms, 2 legs and a head. The arms, for example, contain curves. So he cut open the arms, the skin, and had a look inside. And he found, for example, that the upper arm has a bundle of muscular fibres that contract toward one end to become a tendon attached to the lower arm, and towards the other end they become a tendon attached to the shoulder, which enables a person to flex their arm, and consequently when the arm is straight it's slightly curved, and when the arm is flexed the curvature increases. And this enabled him to draw arms and legs more accurately. He also became curious about the inside of the human body, and as you know, the heart is generally represented by a symmetrical diagram, but it's not actually that shape. And he drew it accurately, with the heart being the centre of the chest towards the left side. He drew the coronary arteries accurately, shaped generally like a crown, and the position of the heart accurately, and he drew a picture of a fetus in the womb. He also drew murals. These are extended diagrams where you have multiple features and multiple people in it. And as you know from emoticons, when a person smiles, their lips are curved upwards. When they're angry, their lips are curved downwards. And when they're sad, they might have a tear. But Da Vinci could depict all sorts of emotions in the way he drew his paintings. And they weren't just round circles with a curved mouth or two dots for eyes. They were actually quite detailed reflections of what different people look like when they're, for example, shocked or surprised or whatever. And you can see from the diagram his understanding of perspective, the way he draws the windows or whatever at the front larger than the windows at the back, so it shows the appearance of a room that is where the foreground is in front, close to the person, and the background is at a distance. Now, because Da Vinci understood the anatomy, it assisted him in sculpture. This is not representing 3D on a two-dimensional canvas. It's actually representing it by the carving of various items in 3D itself. And there's a picture of one of his carvings there. He also was an architect, and he could draw buildings quite accurately, sketch them. And he designed buildings, and he also understood certain architectural or engineering aspects. For example, if you want to support a heavy roof, you need to design it in particular ways. So he understood some engineering principles. He also was an inventor. He may have got some of these ideas from previous individuals, but these are the sorts of things that he did. He developed the self-propelled cart, for example, and this is sort of like a forerunner to the car as we know it today. He also tried experimenting with flight, so he sketched out diagrams of essentially planes, vehicles for flying, with the curvature of the wing. So wings are not on birds are not just flat; they're curved, and they're curved on top and flat or undercurved. And what happens is there's a shorter distance under the wing than there is over the wing. So the amount of air passing by as the bird flies forward is less. There's more air per square inch under the wing than there is over the wing, and that's why birds fly up as they go in the forward direction. That's a principle in planes. He also tried to develop the ornithopter and the helicopter. He also tried to develop an army tank, and this is one of his examples. And with the army tank, there have been some statements that he got the design wrong, but it's also possible that he got it he designed it in such a manner that if a tank was captured by the enemy, they wouldn't know how to get it to work. So it may not have been as wrong as people think. He also developed the 33-barrel cannon and machine guns. And he also developed a crossbow, a giant crossbow that was 27 yards across, and it was designed to fire large stones and firebombs. And it was the strings of the bow were retracted backwards by a ratchet mechanism, and then I understand were kept in place by a bolt, and when you hit that bolt out, the crossbow fires. It was designed as much to scare the enemy rather than actually have any effect. If they saw that crossbow in front of them, they'd be more inclined to run away. Now, I'm not 100% sure of the details of what happened, but he also was involved in military strategy. So I'll give a rough account of what roughly happened, or what I think happened from what I've read. You may need to read more to be more accurate. But one occasion, the town of Pisa was under siege by a large army, but they couldn't penetrate the defences. So the soldiers were just sitting around getting bored and going AWOL because there's nothing to do. And this went on for several months. And they couldn't get the people in the town to surrender because it was too well defended. And so they got people in to plan what might be done to break that siege. And the suggestions that came up were that it was impossible because the town had their own water supply from a river, and that provided them with water for their crops and water for their stock so they could feed themselves. And they could stay there for a year or so, and the army couldn't afford to hang around for that long. That's why it was difficult to break the siege. They weren't willing to surrender under those conditions. So I think it was Da Vinci asked where they get their water from, and it came from the river Arno, which supplied the town. So he asked what the soldiers were doing, and they said they were going back to their farms because they were getting bored. So he suggested to get them busy digging a channel to divert the river water away from the town. If they're doing nothing anyway, this strategy of diverting the river might be a large challenge, but the capacity was there. And then when they finished digging the channel around the town, dam up the river as it enters the town so that the water runs around it. And then the people in the city or the town of Pisa will realise that it doesn't matter how long they hang on for, eventually they're going to run out of food and stuff, and they'll surrender straight away. Now, the plan was to complete the channel so that the citizens would surrender. Da Vinci calculated that they need to dig 1 million tonnes of dirt out of the channel to complete it. However, the hydraulic engineer in charge of the actual digging was Master Colombino, and he didn't follow Da Vinci's instructions on depth, and a storm caused a downpour of rain, causing the flood of water and the collapse of the channel walls. So the plan didn't succeed. Now, it's probably because another person was involved with Machiavelli who collaborated with Da Vinci. He didn't provide enough money or manpower to do the job properly, and that's a common problem with politics and projects. So to save on costs, the engineer Colombino didn't dig the channel deep enough to carry the water away. But nevertheless, Da Vinci continued to develop his interest in hydroengineering and river management, and some obvious ways of preventing problems in the future would be to wait until the warmer months when less likely to rain would be one method, or maybe supervise the engineer would be another. So Leonardo da Vinci had multiple aptitudes, which he developed. He was an artist, an anatomist, a sculptor, an architect, an inventor, an engineer, and a military strategist. In other words, he was a polymath. So unlike Darwin, Semmelweis and Galileo, whose discoveries proved old ideas were wrong or offended the elite establishment and had them resented and ridiculed, Leonardo da Vinci had many talents. He was wanted by the elite establishment to improve their image by painting their portraits and decorating their buildings. And his good fortune in that regard made his life more pleasant and more pleasant than most inventors. So he's my favourite. Thank you for watching.